Hello, I'm Montse Alvarado, and this is EWTN News In Depth.
For the first time in nearly 30 years, we have a real opportunity to get the court out of the abortion business.
Life after Roe, a look ahead at potential Supreme Court action that could change the way life issues are handled across the country.
So I set out to find someone who was providing housing for women in need of housing, and that didn't happen, and so I started in my basement.
Fewer abortions equal a need for stronger safety nets for young mothers. We show you two programs that are working, plus our expert panel weighs in. A tragic case in Britain. The court system says it's time to end life support for a 2-year-old girl against the wishes and religious beliefs of her parents. And we'll tell you about the miracle of snow in the middle of a hot Rome summer. EWTN News In Depth is next.
If Roe is overturned next summer in this case, it will be just the beginning. We will have so much work to do.
The U.S. Supreme Court is set to hear arguments this fall in a major case challenging Roe v. Wade, which established the right to have an abortion in the U.S. in 1973. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization is the first major abortion case to receive a full briefing and oral argument since Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation gave the court a 6-3 conservative majority. The Mississippi law prohibits nearly all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. If the state prevails in defending the law, it could pave the way for lawmakers and legislatures around the country to pass state-level abortion bans of their own without being challenged. The question is, how ready is the U.S. for a post-Roe world to pass state-level bans as well as provide the support many young mothers will need? We begin with reporter Kate Scanlon.
So this picture right here is a photo of our very first baby born into our program.
Carried to Full Term, a Virginia nonprofit, works to provide women facing unplanned pregnancies with housing and other resources like job training or parenting classes. Frances Robin, the group's director, says her mission was born after she volunteered with other pregnancy centers and realized many of the women she worked with were experiencing homelessness, often as a result of their pregnancies.
And after a pregnancy test came back positive, we would hear the deeper stories from women in need of support.
As the Supreme Court prepares to hear a case this fall that may impact the legality of abortion in the United States, some advocates say whatever the future holds, it's life-affirming groups just like Carried to Full Term that can make the biggest difference.
It's one thing to just change a law, but all that really does is cut off supply. We need to be talking about demand.
In Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, the High Court will consider a Mississippi law banning elective abortions after 15 weeks. The Jackson Women's Health Organization, the only licensed abortion facility in Mississippi, sued in response to the law, naming Mississippi State Health Officer Dr. Thomas Dobbs in its challenge. The pre-viability ban sets up a direct challenge to the Supreme Court's previous landmark rulings on abortion, Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which activists on both sides of the debate say may prompt the court to alter or reverse those decisions. Roe legalized abortion nationwide, while Casey held that an undue burden could not be placed on a woman seeking an abortion before an unborn child is viable.
For the first time in nearly 30 years, we have a real opportunity to get the court out of the abortion business.
Americans United for Life filed 2 amicus or friend of the court briefs in the case. Katie Glenn, government affairs counsel for the group, says one of their briefs was filed on behalf of pro-life members of Congress who argued Roe should be overturned to protect the legislative branch's ability to enact and to see enforced laws that address abortion's risks and harms on behalf of the people of the states they represent.
So it really goes into the fact that this is unsettled. After 50 years, 228 members of Congress are calling for Roe to be overturned because it's unworkable, it's caused a mess in the court, and it's taken away power from lawmakers.
Mississippi Attorney General Lynn Fitch said in a statement that 76 amicus briefs were filed on behalf of the state in the case. The large number, she says, shows countless reasons why the court should return the abortion discussion to the legislative branch. Glenn agrees.
For any case, surely it shows how many different diverse interests there are here.
Destiny Herndon de la Rosa of New Wave Feminists says the pro-life movement should work to provide women with so many resources that abortion isn't considered, even if it remained legal.
If we are creating a culture of life, what does that look like? And that's stuff we can be doing right now. That's stuff we can be doing to eliminate abortions right now, no matter what the laws are.
Building that culture of life can take many forms. At Carried to Full Term, it's helping the women in their care break the cycle of homelessness.
We do that through education, through support, through love, through classes, through just being present. It takes a lot.
Kate Scanlon, EWTN News In Depth.
Dobbs will confront the two cases at the center of the right to abortion on several fronts, seeking to return abortion policy to the states. That includes challenging a law now 50 years old with new medical advances that redefine when life in the womb becomes viable, and raising the question, what does it mean to be human? We're joined by a person uniquely qualified to discuss both the Supreme Court case and the larger bioethical issue of how to prepare for a post-Roe world that cherishes and protects life. University of Notre Dame law professor and renowned Catholic bioethicist Carter Snead is on the record. Carter, it's great to have you here with us. First, your expert take on the abortion case the Supreme Court will be hearing late this fall. You filed an amicus brief in the Dobbs case with Professor Mary Ann Glendon, who was on our show a few months ago. Before we talk about that, let's take one step back for our viewers. What is the state of Mississippi's case that the Supreme Court actually addressing?
So the question that the Mississippi Attorney General has sought review in the court, and the question the court has agreed to answer, is very simple and very straightforward. The question is whether or not any political branch of government can ban abortions before viability. That's the question. Or alternatively, are all bans on abortion prior to an unborn child reaching the stage of viability, are those necessarily unconstitutional? And it's an extraordinary opportunity for the court to revisit its jurisprudence because, sadly, we are in some ways alone in the world in this respect. It is the case that Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the most important precedent that creates the law of abortion in America, invented by the Supreme Court in 1973, essentially reaffirmed, although modified in some ways in 1992, says as directly as one could say, the state may not unduly burden a woman's right to abortion before viability, and for sure, a categorical ban, even with some exceptions, is an undue burden. So there's no question that there's a collision course between the Mississippi law and the abortion jurisprudence of the Supreme Court. Only one of those is going to be left standing after this is over, I believe. Around this time next year, we'll know.
Yeah, so let's take a step back. Our viewers all know a lot of the words that you used, but I think that we need to define them a little bit. Everyone knows overturning Roe. I have to ask you to explain that to us as well. That case that you mentioned, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that came almost 20 years after Roe. So in a simple sentence, what did Roe in 1973 do? And then what did Casey layer on top of it?
Roe v. Wade invented out of whole cloth a right to abortion in 1973. Under the auspices of interpreting the Constitution of the United States. Of course, the Supreme Court, as your viewers know, their job is to interpret and apply the Constitution of the United States. They claim that the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868 when abortion was illegal by codified law everywhere and by common law everywhere, that somehow that amendment made it impossible for the states to extend even minimal protections to unborn children. So about 100 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified, the Supreme Court came up with the novel and entirely invented theory that somehow that amendment, that and the part of the amendment they were talking about, guarantees due process. That is, it says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or life, liberty, or property without due process of law. They claim that that language means that there's a right to abortion that overrides every state law in the country, and that's precisely what happened in 1973. So Roe v. Wade, in very short order, created a right to abortion which had never before existed and undid every legal protection for the unborn child throughout the United States. That was 1973. 1992, the court was called upon to revisit the question of abortion, and the court made some modifications to the jurisprudence, which are sort of granular and probably not of interest to your viewers. But the fundamental point is in 1992, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, a bare majority of 5 justices said that abortion has to remain legal in the United States. There is a constitutionally protected liberty interest in abortion, and they divided the legal framework into two parts. One is prior to fetal viability, when the baby can survive outside the womb around 22 weeks, 24 weeks. That line, as you said in the outset, moves according to technology, according to access to resources, according even to the race and sex of the unborn child. It's obviously an unstable line, but they said before viability, the state may not unduly burden a right to abortion, thus creating effectively a super right to abortion, which is even more protective than any rights that are in the Bill of Rights itself, more protected than the right to free speech, more protected than the right to free exercise of religion, more protected than the right against unreasonable searches and seizures. The right to pre-viability abortion, according to Planned Parenthood versus Casey, is essentially inviolable. After viability, they said, well, yeah, it's a super right. And they said after viability, you can regulate abortion, but you always have to make an exception, not just for the life of the mother, which all laws had in any event prior to 1973, but also for the health of the mother, which the court defined in a case in 1973 called Doe v. Bolton as any aspect of a woman's well-being as determined by the abortionist, which creates an essentially unlimited exception that applies after viability. Getting back to the Mississippi case, though, you can see that it's impossible to reconcile a rule of the Supreme Court that says there shall be no undue burdens on abortion prior to viability with a law that bans abortion prior to viability. It bans abortion at 15 weeks. So intellectual integrity and intellectual honesty requires the court to either dismantle the abortion jurisprudence, which has bedeviled our country for the past, 40 years or 48 years.
48 years, yeah.
Or to dismantle that, or to reinforce it and to strike down this law that's very modest and is even more permissive than most laws around the world, even in countries like France, where abortion is more restrictive. Compared
to Europe, we're definitely at a disadvantage if we're unborn in this country. You were talking about the issue of the 5-4, so the fact that the court was divided on this. Everyone forgets that that's actually part of the history of abortion in this country. It's never been a full sweep, and it's never been something that was accepted easily by the court. You talk at length about abortion in your fascinating new book, What It Means to Be Human. It explains the gifts and the challenges of being human. And what is this individualistic ideology you diagnose in your book that is so problematic?
Well, so it's called expressive individualism, and it sounds highfalutin, but it's an account of what it means to be and flourish as a human being that I think is probably recognizable to every American living today. It is a vision of my life and your life where I define myself fundamentally abstracted from all my connections to friends and family and relationships and community and nature itself. I define myself entirely by virtue of my mind or my will. I am my mind or my will, and my flourishing consists in looking inside myself, not outside, but inside myself, for the authentic and original and maybe transgressive truths that I find in there, and then I configure my life plan accordingly. That's what flourishing is under expressive individualism. And if you look at what the court says in Roe v. Wade, and even more so in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, they invented a right to abortion based on the idea that the burdens of unwanted pregnancy and unwanted parenthood are so frustrating and so limiting on the right to define your own open future. This is the mystery of life passage that Justice Kennedy has been justly criticized for since he wrote it in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, saying at the heart of liberty is the right to define for yourself the meaning of life, life itself, the universe, et cetera. That is an anthem of expressive individualism. And the court says, well, we don't really have the word abortion in the Constitution. We don't really have even the word privacy in the Constitution, but what we're going to do is invent a right to abortion to free women to pursue their open future, because the burdens of unplanned pregnancy and unwanted parenthood are so significant that we have to provide this right if there's to be justice in America. And that right emerges from a framing of the question, the human question in which abortion arises, as taking the mother and the unborn child and making them strangers to one another, pitting them against one another, and describing the scenario in which this question arises as a fight between a person and something less than a person against scarce resources, the bodily resources of the mother, the future of the mother. And if that's how you describe a situation like that, it's not surprising the court's answer to that problem is to license the use of private violence against the intruding stranger. But as we all know, pregnancy and parenthood is not a relationship among strangers. It's a relationship among parent and child, mother and child. And if we were to reframe the question as a crisis involving a mother and a child, we wouldn't give one of them a right to use violence against the other. What we would do is we would drop what we're doing and we would rush to their aid and provide them both with the care they need and the love that they need and the support they need throughout pregnancy and after that child is born, to surround that mother, that child, that family, that community with support and love. And that all comes from reframing the question away from expressive individualism into taking seriously that natural relationship between mother and child.
And I think that's your call to action in your book for all of our viewers and for our country, really, as Catholics and as Americans, to take care of women and children and to pursue policies that will do that. Thank you so much, Carter, for joining us and explaining the background of this case.
Thank you, Monse.
For more specifics on the state of abortion in the U.S. with our expert panel next, and the long-lasting impact our abortion culture has had on American women. EWTN News In Depth will be right back.
The truth is, you abort that baby, and that's where your problems begin.
Words of wisdom, this couple's mission conceived in tragedy to help young mothers facing crisis pregnancies. Their faith journey a little later. And life or death, the court system steps in to make a decision about the fate of a little girl against the religious convictions of her parents. Why are they being ignored? We take a deep dive into a tragic situation up ahead. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. We continue the conversation about Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, widely viewed as one of the most important abortion cases the Supreme Court will hear since Roe v. Wade. Abortion statistics in the United States are not an exact science, as two large states, New York and California, do not have to report their numbers to the Centers for Disease Control. But according to Guttmacher Institute, a Planned Parenthood think tank, there were more than 860,000 abortions performed in 2017. That's 18% of pregnancies, excluding miscarriages. We're fortunate to have two expert voices joining us today to discuss the state of abortion in the United States and the potential impact of the Dobbs case. Helen Alvarez is professor of law at George Mason University, and Catherine Hadro is the host of EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. Thank you for joining us today, ladies. Catherine, you've dedicated the past 4 years to covering comprehensive issues surrounding life on your show, EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. How is this case challenging abortion restrictions in Mississippi different from other cases that have tried to challenge legalized abortion?
Well, this is significant, Monse, because these justices have decided to take up this case in the first place. That's incredibly significant. They're signaling they're open to reconsidering abortion laws in the United States. You know, it's nothing new to have a big abortion case at the Supreme Court, as you know, but those often pertain to bans on specific abortion procedures or health standards at abortion facilities, whereas this goes after viability, which was established in Roe. That big question, can you ban an abortion before a baby is able to live outside of her mother's womb on her own? The justices are going to examine that very question. And I should also note this is significant because this is the first major abortion case with Justice Amy Coney Barrett on the bench. And while the jury is still out on how she might rule on this, pro-lifers are optimistic that the justices are considering this question in the first place.
Helen, you filed a brief in the case on behalf of 240 women scholars and professionals and pro-life feminist organizations that discussed, among other important points, what you call out as the great farce of economic and social opportunities that would be available to women because of abortion. Can you explain this?
Sure. So Teresa Collette and Erica Bakayaki and myself and Elizabeth Kirk, so law professors and scholars regarding women in the family, corralled together 240 women with PhD, MD, JD degrees, a number of pro-life feminist organizations, and we were able to make the case that I think the Supreme Court really needs to hear before it feels comfortable overruling Roe and the 1992 case, Casey, that upheld Roe. Even though we all know that the right of abortion is put in the Constitution under privacy. In the Casey decision, the court says, listen, we don't think women can be equal. without access to abortion. This is really the great lie, that abortion causes women's economic and social progress. It's really a terrible thing to say about women and about progress if you think about it. So really briefly, we put together the evidence of all the laws and cases that before Roe, during Roe, and after Roe were already promoting women's equality and progress without any reference to abortion. We critique these studies that claim to show that having a child, spells the end of progress for women, and having an abortion is the key to her success. And then we did this very detailed empirical piece at the end where we show that rates and ratios of abortion, the number per pregnancies, the number per 1,000 women, really have no relationship to women's progress. Sure, women's rates of going to school, entrepreneurship, getting into public office, they rose in the late 70s and 80s when abortion, was early in its legality. But then when abortion rates and ratios began to plummet, and I mean they're 50% of what they were in 1989, and they've continued to plummet to the present day, it turns out women's progress continued to go up, 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 up. In other words, there isn't even a correlation between abortion and women's progress, let alone a causation. And then the final point we make is that abortion has really changed a lot of things for women that the court ought to think about. It has upended relationships with men once you separate sex from tomorrow, from marriage, from children. And it basically has left corporations in particular free to ignore women having children and not to accommodate them, and basically to force them to meet the standard of sort of the man without children. So that's a lot, but all of that was compressed into the brief.
It's incredible. It was a fantastic brief, and I encourage our viewers to read it if they have the chance or the inkling of talking about legal aspects of this case. But Catherine, I want to talk to you about the social aspects of it and government power. Roe and Casey are often criticized as examples of Supreme Court decisions that have changed the law through the courts to avoid democratic debate. What's the state of abortion in the United States today at the state level?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because it's been an incredibly strong and successful year for the pro-life movement at the state level. I was looking at the latest numbers, and there have been nearly 600 pro-life bills introduced across 47 states this year alone, Monse. And I want to say about over 80 of those have already been enacted into law. That's incredibly successful. The Guttmacher Institute, which you cited earlier, they are a pro-abortion research group, and they have said that 2021 is on track to be the most devastating when it comes to pro-life state legislation. So when the Guttmacher Institute says something is devastating, pro-lifers typically celebrate that in that case. But I think this does emphasize and point to the significant role that state legislatures and governors have in advancing a culture of life. And I think it's important to highlight this because it's not a great year for the pro-life cause here in Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C., but pro-life viewers should be optimistic and hopeful at all the great successes happening at the state level.
And Catherine, Helen mentioned companies, corporations. What can they do to be open to life?
Oh my goodness. Well, there are so many ways, and we're starting to see companies get more creative in this way as well, whether it's longer paid maternity leave, paternity leave as well. That's something that I think there needs to be a greater push for when it comes to companies. Also, leave for miscarriages. I covered this really devastating story of a teacher locally here in DC who had a miscarriage. She had a stillborn baby and was not given any leave for that, even though she carried that baby and had a very traumatic birthing experience. So I think companies should be challenged specifically when it comes to paid maternity and paternity leave and miscarriage care.
Helen, feminism tends to be a dirty word in the church, and you work with and represent various feminist organizations, New Wave Feminism, Feminists Choosing Life of New York, Feminists for Nonviolent Choices, organizations that are not necessarily religious and some openly atheist. How do you combine that feminist and pro-life label?
I'll never forget a papal audience in 1998. I was over in Rome giving a paper, and John Paul II raises his finger. It was a women's group, and he looks at us and he says very carefully, "I am the feminist pope." And then he threw his head back and burst out laughing. What he meant was what the church always means by this, which is looking out for the true good of women. This question of what the true good of women is, the answers are really widely shared, and they're shared among women of faith and women of no faith. It's a lot of it is objectively fairly obvious. So we had a bunch of pro-life feminist groups get together, at least one of whom declares themselves explicitly atheist, to say that the reason, the science, the empirical data on this points toward there not being a relationship between the good of women's health and equality and abortion. We felt it was important to put that to the court, not because religion does not marry faith and reason. It does, and in fact, in the Catholic Church, that's a great source of pride, but because we knew that those looking on the outside and perhaps the justices themselves would want, explicit confirmation that what we were proposing about women's real good is something that can be embraced as a matter of science, common sense, and reason, and was not in any way altered by the perspective of faith of any of the signers.
And something that can affect all women. Catherine, leaning into this idea of controversies within movements, the law in Mississippi is a 15-week ban, and many religious communities reject any kind of incremental approach to banning abortion and say only complete bans that reject abortion from the moment of conception should be supported. How have you covered this issue?
You're hitting on something really important, Monse, a really tough conversation. We know that life begins at conception. That is when there is unique human DNA present. And so that is why there are pro-life leaders who say these incremental bans, 20-week bans, 15-week bans, that's compromising, that's negotiating with abortion advocates. But then you have other pro-life leaders who say, listen, these incremental bans, they're not ideal, but there's something and they're working, and this has to be our strategy in order to ultimately end abortion. So you named the elephant in the room. There is debate in the pro-life movement. That's absolutely true. But the way I like to think of it as the pro-life movement is the big open tent where there is room for discussion and debate. And so on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, I like to highlight that unity aspect and that strength aspect there instead of focus on the division. But I will say for our Catholic viewers, if they notice maybe there's a pro-life debate happening in their state with state legislation, defer and look at what your state's Catholic conference is doing.
Helen, we will look out to see what else you publish on this. And Catherine, we're so grateful for everything you do with Pro-Life Weekly. We'll keep up with how you're covering this issue and this case. Thank you so much. Be sure to catch Catherine on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly every Thursday evening at 10 p.m. Eastern with an encore presentation on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. She covers all the latest pro-life related news from conception to natural death with leading experts who give perspective and context to this important subject. To get a better understanding of the Church's teaching on abortion, head over to the EWTN website. Type in abortion in the search bar for a host of information. And for post-abortive hope and healing, reach out to the Project Rachel or the Sisters of Life online. Up next, news headlines in This Week in Review, including this announcement from New York City.
The key to NYC Pass will be a first-in-the-nation approach. It will require vaccination for workers and customers in indoor dining, in indoor fitness facilities, indoor entertainment facilities.
Mandatory COVID vaccinations. More and more organizations say it's time, but pushback continues from those who don't want them. That report coming up. And our cameras took you on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land the other week. When we come back, the world religious site you would most like to visit. The results of our EWTN News In Depth viewer poll up ahead. Growing alarm about the spread of the COVID Delta variant tops the week in review. The danger it poses is catching the attention of many, as the vaccination rate is again showing an uptick after many weeks of sluggish participation. And more businesses and governments are now requiring vaccination. One of the latest, California on Thursday announced all healthcare workers in the state must be fully vaccinated by September 30th. Only limited religious exemptions will be allowed. The latest numbers from the Centers for Disease Control show a rise in COVID cases in all 50 states. 7 states with the lowest vaccination rates accounted for half of the country's new cases and hospitalizations this past week. Of those states, 1/3 of all the new COVID cases in the U.S. are in Florida and Texas. The Delta variant is surging as teachers and students are preparing to go back to school. Leading medical experts have some advice.
Getting everyone in your household who is 12 years of age and older fully vaccinated before the school year starts should be number one on everyone's back to school checklist.
Of course, children under 12 cannot currently receive the vaccine, so doctors stress other preventative strategies continue, like masking, physical distancing, and hand washing to protect them. Recommendations for schools vary based on the changes in the pandemic from one community to the next, but how administrators will handle school reopening this fall has become a source of worry and tension for parents across the country. Within the next few days, the Pentagon is expected to recommend mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations for all active duty troops. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin had said he was not comfortable mandating shots until the FDA fully approved the vaccines, but he's reportedly rethinking that as the Delta variant spikes. About 64% of active duty military members are fully vaccinated, a rate the Defense Department considers unacceptably low, potentially impacting troop readiness and ability to deploy. Tech giant Microsoft is now requiring its employees to get vaccinated. Employees, vendors, and guests must show proof of vaccination to enter their buildings. Microsoft says it will work with employees who have a protected reason for not being vaccinated. The company has also pushed back its planned reopen date to October, a trend we're seeing well in other companies. New York City is now the first major U.S. city to mandate proof of COVID vaccination in order to attend a movie, dine in restaurants, or work out in a gym. The controversial move is sparking outcry from some who say it's a violation of civil liberties, medical privacy, religious freedom, and is a form of segregation. Mayor Bill de Blasio says it is a needed step to get back to normal and will be life-saving. The program will begin in mid-August and be fully enforced in September. Some New Yorkers took to the streets to protest, including these New York Metropolitan Transit and Port Authority workers. Their concern about civil liberties and choice are reflected in the protests around the globe, including this one in Italy, where these citizens are upset about the vaccination green pass needed for access to everything from restaurants, museums, and fairs to swimming pools. The leader of the World Health Organization is asking wealthy countries to impose a moratorium on COVID booster shots. He says poorer nations should have an opportunity to immunize their populations first before wealthier nations come back for additional doses. Though boosters are not yet available in the U.S., late this week, Germany, France, Israel, and the UK announced they've given them the green light. The Centers for Disease Control issued a new temporary eviction moratorium on Tuesday. The prior moratorium expired last weekend, and with more than 10 million people behind on their rent around the country, many of them could have been thrown out of their homes during this pandemic. The new moratorium extends through the beginning of October and covers areas experiencing high COVID cases, which currently includes about 90% of the U.S. population. Billions of dollars in federal funds have been allocated to reimburse landlords for rent they are due, but many states have been very slow to release that aid.
Well, it looks like the money is there, and it's either still in Washington, or it's down at state and local government, or somewhere in between. It doesn't seem to me require any additional legislative action. They need to get the money out there that's already been made available so it can solve the problem.
The moratorium will likely face legal challenges. The Supreme Court let the original eviction ban expire at the end of July. But while potential lawsuits work their way through the court system, this new moratorium provides additional time for rental assistance already approved to reach those who need it. Agreement on a bipartisan infrastructure bill funding so-called hard infrastructure like roads, bridges, transit, broadband, and power grids is getting closer to reality in the U.S. Senate. However, despite a week of late-night negotiations that appeared close, discussions on the more than $1 trillion plan continue, and the Senate deal is not yet done. As of late Thursday, the Senate had considered 22 amendments, but numerous objections were raised, so votes on those amendments were not cast. Backers of the bill hope the logjam will be broken and progress made this weekend. Former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick is facing a new civil sex abuse lawsuit in New Jersey. This comes after he was criminally charged in Massachusetts last week for sexually abusing a teenage boy. He's the first U.S. cardinal to be criminally charged in abusing a minor. The case in New Jersey accuses McCarrick of abusing a minor while he was Archbishop of Newark in 1986. Wednesday marked 1 year since the horrific explosion in Lebanon at the Beirut port. Official records say 214 people died and thousands were maimed and injured in what was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. It was a result of hundreds of tons of ammonium nitrate igniting after a fire broke out. The blast flattened thousands of homes and businesses nearby. Families of the victims and several thousand Lebanese held a moment of silent prayer at the foot of the silos that exploded. The names of each person killed in the explosion were read out loud. Religious leaders from different sects in Lebanon led a prayer for those lost, including Cardinal Bashara Rai, head of Lebanon's Maronite Catholic Church. Lebanon is suffering severe economic strife since the blast, caused by political crises, COVID, and more, with 60% of the country living in poverty. The United States and France are pledging hundreds of millions in humanitarian aid.
What we can do is continue supporting the Lebanese armed forces. That's a big initiative that has been pushed by In Defense of Christians. We also appreciate advocacy by Pope Francis and Cardinal Rai, who's the patriarch of the Maronite Catholic Church. And then obviously we need to continue supporting humanitarian efforts in Lebanon. IDC was very pleased to see the State Department and USAID announce an additional $98 million in humanitarian aid to Lebanon.
Meantime, there's anger over how the Lebanese government has handled the disaster. Protesters gathered on highways and streets. They threw Molotov cocktails and were met with tear gas from security forces. Demonstrators want accountability, as the investigation into the explosion has yet to answer any questions, including who ordered the shipment of chemicals and why officials ignored international warnings of their danger. Pope Francis took a moment this week to remember the victims of the Beirut explosion and urged the international community to help Lebanon overcome its economic crisis. It was his first general audience since undergoing colon surgery last month. The Holy Father's address was dedicated to the theme, "There's just one gospel," and was the third in a new cycle of catechesis on St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians. Last month, EWTN News In Depth cameras took you on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Rome correspondent Colin Flynn brought us stunning images from Israel, including the Basilica of the Annunciation in Nazareth, where it's believed Mary received a visit from the Archangel Gabriel, the Basilica of the Nativity in Bethlehem, Jesus' birthplace, and the Old City of Jerusalem, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which holds two holy sites, where Jesus was crucified and Jesus' empty tomb. We followed up with a poll on our social media channels to see where you would most want to go on pilgrimage. More than 250 people voted. 49% of you said your top pick is to travel to the Holy Land. The second most popular site in the poll was Vatican City. Other responses included Lourdes, France, and Guadalupe, Mexico City. Our team here at EWTN News In Depth loves to hear your input. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to take part in our next interactive poll, and we'll be sure to report the outcome in an upcoming broadcast. Next, who should make life and death decisions for a child? Parents or the courts? Details of a heartbreaking case in Britain. A Jewish couple says their religious beliefs are not being honored. And the tradition of Our Lady of the Snows. We take you to the commemoration in Rome a little later. The European Court of Human Rights has rejected an appeal to keep 2-year-old Alta Fixler on life support. In the Right to Life debate, it's the latest in a series of cases over the last decade in Britain, including the Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans cases, that has caused outcry over parental rights and garnered international attention. Alta Fixler was born 8 weeks prematurely in Manchester, England, and suffered severe brain damage at birth. Since then, the now 2-year-old has been receiving life-sustaining care. The doctors say Alta has no conscious awareness and that her brain injury will inevitably result in early death. Manchester University National Health Service Foundation Trust petitioned the British High Court for permission to remove the little girl's life support, arguing she had no quality of life and was experiencing pain. UK law allows the courts to decide the best interests of children in extreme medical cases, although multiple pediatric neurologists contested the hospital's position, insisting that Alta did not feel pain. Hospitals in Israel and the U.S. have offered to care for Alta, but the court ruled moving Alta to another hospital would be for no medical benefit and expose Alta to more pain. Alta's parents moved to the UK in 2014. They're Israeli citizens and Orthodox Hasidic Jews. Abraham Fixler is also a U.S. citizen. They say taking their daughter off of life support contradicts their Orthodox Jewish faith and Israeli law, which commands them to preserve human life and forbids actions to end it. Their legal team requested permission from the UK Supreme Court to move Alta to a hospital in Jerusalem and were denied, which prompted their move to ask the European Court of Human Rights to intervene. More than 40,000 people signed a petition in support of Alta's life. Politicians, clergymen, and human rights activists from around the world have raised their voices against the hospital's request to remove life support, including New York Senator Chuck Schumer, who worked to obtain a visa for Alta to come to the U.S. to receive care. In an urgent letter to the British ambassador to the U.S., Senator Schumer wrote, "I urge that all health decisions that are against the wishes of the family be suspended until the citizenship process is complete and Alta can travel to the U.S. with her U.S. citizen father, Mr. Abraham Fixler." New Jersey senators followed up with their own letters to the British ambassador, and 10 Republican senators have also written to President Biden, urging him to advocate on behalf of the Fixler family. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin asked Prince Charles for help in caring for Alta as well. The hospital has stood firm in its position to remove all forms of life support, saying the High Court and now the Court of Appeals has agreed that very sadly it's in Alta's best interests for life-sustaining treatment to be withdrawn. Joining me now to weigh in on this case is the Fixler's family spokesperson, Yossi Gostetner. Yossi, we realize these are hard moments for the Fixler family with the crushing news from the courts. How's the family holding up?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. It's obviously very, very difficult for the parents to process what has been happening over the last few weeks, where court after court in the UK as well as in Europe are essentially saying that parents do not have the right or understanding to decide what is the best interest of a child. Sadly, as it is the case in many appeals or cases that make it to the Supreme Court, they generally do not, interfere or overturn lower court cases, especially things that may be of greater news interest. Sometimes they don't want to get involved. So when one court after the other in the UK system is basically giving permission for the NHS, which oversees health policy in the UK, to discontinue the life of this 2.5-year-old, it is devastating. It basically means that at any time, the hospital can start the 72-hour clock to discontinue the care for Alta. Now, Alta as a person has grown physically since she was born. The court argues, or the lower court in the UK argued, that moving Alta will cause pain. Now, medical professionals who know how to move someone from room to room within a medical facility in Manchester know how to do that.
That's right.
Yeah, know how to do that in a careful and delicate way, from a room to a medical flight, and from medical flight to an ambulance and into its facility here in the US or in the UK. So it's interesting reasoning to prohibit trying to care for Alta, especially the medical professionals in the US and in Israel are saying that she has the potential of recovering. And and parents, whether on their own device or whether influenced by their religious teachings, have the right and responsibility to try to find the best care.
That's right. Yossi, this case brings up exactly that point of parental rights and religious freedom. Why is it that Alta's parents can't bring her home to the U.S. or to Israel for treatment? What's stopping them?
So because once a person is under medical care in the UK, my understanding is there isn't this thing of a person leaving a hospital against medical advice, the AMAs. Certainly adults in the US, they can do that. I'm not even sure how it works with children. in the U.S., and may God, protect me and my family from ever needing to figure this out. But the point being that since the medical system in the UK is more like the government has control, it's not just oversight, which is always good. Some oversight. It's like they have control, literal control on people's medical decision, especially once the person is within a medical institution, and especially if it's the case of a child.
Right.
So she has been in this Manchester facility for 2.5 years. I don't think anyone credible would argue that a facility in Manchester, no offense to the professionalism of the staff, but nobody would think that a local institution in Manchester has the same capabilities as some of the experts and institutions here in the US or over in Israel. So when Alta is not even a UK citizen, although she was born there, but her citizenship was never processed, the parents are, the father is Israeli and US, then essentially the government is telling someone who is not a citizen of the country, parents who have citizenship in other countries say, you cannot go.
Right.
Because we accept this and this medical opinion, which is strange and sad when you have different
international
opinions.
Offers for help. Right. Let's talk about that, the international intervention. So last week you had 10 Republican senators who sent a letter offering care, saying that this was unjust. And now this week you have 8 Democrats who are raising their voices, saying that they want to protect Alta, that Alta deserves the right to live, that she's being denied her human rights. Yossi, why is this so important?
But the letter that Schumer sent this week was carbon copied to Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State.
Right.
So you basically have there a coalition of 18 senators, which would be 10 Republicans and 8 Democrats. It's not the typical, it's not even the typical, you said before, the right to life. It's when you have
it's bipartisan support, which is unusual to have anything bipartisan nowadays.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we didn't succeed in having bipartisan signatures on one letter, but when you have, 10 on one party, 8 in the other in the Senate, putting the full weight behind it, I think a lot of senators are not necessarily, pro-life, understand the basic concept of of medical rights in the U.S., of parental rights in the U.S., of parents deciding. And if someone is a citizen of the U.S. and happens so to be living in the UK to make a medical decision, all right, if you want to make a decision as to what your country is supposed to do, fine, do it. But to preclude the parents to try to go back to a country where the father is a citizen, either of Israel and the U.S., say you can't benefit of medical expertise, that's something which it crosses party lines.
It does, and it's a human rights issue, doing everything to save one life. Yossi, thank you so much for joining us and explaining this important case. We'll be watching and praying for Alta as this story continues. EWTN News In Depth continues.
This is not just helping a woman through a 9-month pregnancy. It's helping to break a cycle of poverty and give them a new lease on life.
Easing the burden of young mothers with unexpected and unwanted pregnancies. We'll tell you about a program that is pro-life well past the baby's birth. During today's program, we focused on pro-life issues and support for women and families struggling with decisions about life, despite medical or economic concerns. Reporter Mark Irons introduces us to a couple and the program they started to support life. Tragically, it rose out of their own loss. Here's their faith journey in depth.
The motto at the Paul Stefan Foundation, saving babies, one mom at a time. It was the story of newborn baby Paul that first began building up this foundation 16 years ago.
This doctor said, your baby has a diaphragmatic hernia. Would you like to have an abortion?
Expecting their 6th child, Randy and Evelyn James were shocked when their doctors asked if they wanted to terminate the pregnancy after the diagnosis of a fatal lung condition. Abortion was not an option for the James. Paul was born and lived for around 40 minutes. Randy says an abortion would have taken away the joy of meeting their son.
Delivering our baby, holding our baby, kissing our baby, taking pictures, and having our family come in and hold baby Paul.
Father Stefan Starzinski, a friend of the family, along with Evelyn and Randy, all felt called on a mission to provide women with the needed resources and assistance so they don't even have to consider abortion.
When you help one baby and one mother, then you realize, why can't I help two? Well, how can I help three?
The smiles say it all here at the Paul Stefan Foundation. Randy and Evelyn James have provided a loving environment for children and their mothers.
Randy and Evelyn, they are just amazing.
Both TG and Samantha,
they're very patient with you, like they meet you where you are.
Were in desperate situations when they were pregnant. Samantha was homeless.
I was literally struggling just by myself.
And they're still receiving support for themselves and their daughters.
They just keep you like as a family member.
The Paul Stefan Foundation now has this new home in Orange, Virginia.
We can have up to 21 women and their children.
It has all the needed accommodations, and with renovations complete, it will begin filling up this week. These custom-designed rooms made for mothers in need.
When they come here, they have everything for them so they could get back on their feet, get their dignity back, and move on.
A key aspect that sets this place apart is the provided education and job training component.
A program that it actually is paying for us to go to school and has a guaranteed internship at the end. They're supplying laptops and everything.
Preparing women for careers that will help them succeed when they leave is the motivation for John Kleinsmith, the education director here.
The educational program is just another extension of the opportunities that the Paul Stefan Foundation is extending. Beyond food and shelter and encouragement.
Starting the Paul Stefan Foundation has been the result of prayer and faith, but there are real needs. The hope is that with more people pitching in, homes like this will develop around the country. Father Stefan says it's the words of Mother Angelica, the founder of EWTN, that have inspired him.
And she had a phrase, unless you're willing to do the ridiculous, God won't do the miraculous.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
A pro-life and pro-woman response. And finally today, it may be a hot summer, but snow fell this week in Rome. According to tradition, in the 4th century, snow fell in Rome on August 5th, indicating where to build a new basilica in honor of the Virgin Mary. On that very spot is where St. Mary Major Basilica stands today. Every year, there's great anticipation and celebration of the miracle of snow, when millions of white rose petals descend from the ceiling. Enjoy this year's commemoration in our Images of the Week. What a beautiful tradition. And that does it for this edition of EWTN News in Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. We appreciate you watching and hope you'll join us again next week as we continue the conversation about our Catholic life. See you then.